Since 1976, Ohio has executed 56 death row inmates, ranking 8th in the United States, but among them are names that shook the entire justice system. They did not just kill, they killed with cold calculation, sometimes without emotion, sometimes for pleasure. Some killed out of hatred, others because of prejudice, and some just to see what it felt like. But eventually, they all walked into the same room, a room with no way out. In this video, you'll witness 10 of the most brutal individuals ever executed in Ohio. We'll tell you what crimes they committed, what they chose for their last meal, and what, if anything, they said when facing death. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're interested in stories from death row, and let me know in the comments which country you're watching this video from. Now, let's begin with one of the most notorious. First, Alton Coleman. In 1984, the name Alton Coleman became a nightmare haunting the American Midwest. Born in Waukegan, Illinois, Coleman already had a history of sex crimes, but no one could have predicted that. Within just 53 days, he would become the target of one of the largest manhunts in FBI history. With his girlfriend Deborah Brown, a woman with a mild developmental disability, recently released from a mental hospital, Coleman began a cross-state killing spree, 6 states. At least 8 people dead, dozens more assaulted and raped. Among them were children, the elderly, both black and white victims. From Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, to Michigan, Kentucky, and Ohio, the pair traveled constantly, stealing cars and breaking into homes. Their first victim was 9-year-old Vernita Wheat, lured and murdered in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Then came Tamika Turks, age 9, and her mother Donna Williams, 25, raped, murdered, or disappeared and later found dead. Palestine Booker, 28, was killed and dumped in an Indiana state park. Virginia Temple and her 9-year-old daughter Rochelle were murdered in their home in Toledo, Ohio. 15-year-old Tony Story vanished and was later found dead in Cincinnati. Marlene Walters, 44, was beaten to death with a crowbar while her husband was tied up and tortured. The crimes followed the same chilling pattern approach with a smile or false kindness. Then strike without warning, vanishing into the night. Each case was a private hell, and the survivors like Trina Gaither and Olin Carmichael carry scars not just on their bodies, but in their minds for life. On July 20th, 1984, Coleman and Brown were captured in Evanston, Illinois. After being recognized from a TV news report, Coleman received death sentences in 3 states: Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. But it was Ohio that carried it out first. On April 26, 2002, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, Alton Coleman entered the execution chamber. He showed no emotion, offered no message to the victims' families. His final meal was a feast well-done filet mignon, fried chicken breast, French fries, sweet potato pie with whipped cream, French dressing salad, broccoli with cheese, collard greens, onion rings, biscuits, and a can of cherry Coke. Not a single apology, not a single tear. He simply bowed his head and slowly recited Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The prayer echoed through the cold, white room, but for the 8 lives lost and those still grieving, it was never enough to be called justice. Second, Kenneth Byros. When it comes to executions in Ohio, the name Kenneth Byros cannot be left out, not only for the crime he committed, but for how his death marked a turning point in American legal history. It began in February of 1991. In Brookfield, a town in northeastern Ohio, Tammy Engstrom, a kind, hard-working 22-year-old mother, simply needed a ride home after meeting friends. Kenneth Byros, a familiar face in town, offered to take her, but instead of driving her home, he led her down a deserted road, and there ended her life. He didn't stop there. What he did next was so cruel that even seasoned forensic investigators fell silent. Tammy's body was dismembered and scattered across 2 states. Some parts left in a sewer, others buried around Byros' yard in Pennsylvania. When arrested, Byros claimed he had lost control and blamed alcohol, but the jury didn't see a man out of control. They saw someone cold and calculated. He was sentenced to death, but Kenneth Byros' story didn't end there. Nearly 19 years later, the state of Ohio finally carried out his execution. He became the first person in the United States to be executed with a single-drug lethal injection, replacing the traditional 3-drug method, which had been criticized as causing prolonged pain, on December 8, 2009, at the Lucasville facility. Kenneth Byros entered the death chamber. His final meal was elaborate cheese pizza with mushrooms, onions, and green peppers, crispy onion rings, deep-fried mushrooms, Doritos, French onion dip, blueberry ice cream, a can of Dr. Pepper, and cherry pie. And when facing the final injection, he spoke calm, steady, "I'm sorry, truly sorry. I want to thank my family and friends for their prayers, support, and belief in me. Father, I now receive your pardon to enter heaven. I'll now spend my holiday with God and my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Peace be with everyone. Amen." Those final words to Tammy's family may have offered a sense of closure, but the painful truth remains. Tammy died because she trusted the wrong person. Third, Dennis McGuire. In February of 1989, in Preble County, Ohio, a young woman named Joy Stewart, 22 years old and in the early stages of pregnancy, left home to look for a job. She never came back. Days later, her body was discovered in a wooded area, and the horror of what had happened shook the entire community. The man convicted Dennis McGuire, a previously convicted felon who had tried to appear friendly with the victim. The investigation revealed that McGuire had approached Joy with a polite demeanor, but what followed was a series of actions that led to an irreversible end. He was sentenced to death based on DNA evidence and multiple witness testimonies. But what made Dennis McGuire's case stand out wasn't just the crime, it was the way he was executed. In 2014, due to a shortage of lethal injection drugs, the state of Ohio changed its method using a combination of midazolam and hydromorphone that had never been tested before. McGuire became the first person in history to be executed with this drug cocktail. On January 16, 2014, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, McGuire entered the death chamber. His final meal included roast beef, fried chicken, a bagel with cream cheese, fries with onions, potato salad, butter pecan ice cream, and a can of Coca-Cola. About 12 seconds after the drugs were administered, he cried out, "I feel my whole body burning." Instead of lasting just a few minutes as expected, the execution dragged on for 25 minutes. Witnesses described unusual reactions, discomfort, and labored breathing, reigniting the debate over the humanity of capital punishment. For Joy Stewart's family, they said, "We have no regrets. He got what he deserved for what he did." But for legal observers, the case of Dennis McGuire opened a new chapter, not just in the pursuit of justice, but in the moral boundaries of modern punishment. Fourth, Robert Van Hook. On February 18, 1985, in Cincinnati, Ohio, what began as a casual meeting at a gay bar ended in tragedy. Robert Van Hook, 25 years old, entered a gay bar that winter night not out of curiosity or friendship, but with a much colder purpose. There, he met David Self, also 25, a kind, open-hearted man who believed in kindness and genuine connection. Van Hook appeared friendly. They talked, shared some laughs. For David, it was probably just a normal encounter, but Van Hook was watching, evaluating, and choosing. When the two left the bar together and headed to David's apartment, The city remained quiet. No one knew that only one of them would live to see the sunrise. In court, prosecutors revealed that Van Hook had used the same tactic before, befriending men only to attack them. His motive was believed to be rooted in deep-seated hatred, possibly tied to sexual identity. This case, therefore, wasn't just a personal crime, it became a landmark in raising awareness and legal protection for the LGBTQ+ community. After the murder, Van Hook fled to Florida. There, he unexpectedly walked into a police station and said, "I did the same thing as in Ohio. I killed a man." The confession led Florida authorities to contact Ohio. Van Hook was extradited back to Cincinnati and brought to justice. After a short trial, he was sentenced to death. And then, time passed silently. 33 years, Van Hook remained on death row, surviving multiple execution delays, appeals, and debates over his mental health and childhood abuse. But in the end, the sentence stood. On July 18, 2018, at the Lucasville prison in Ohio, Robert Van Hook was taken to the execution chamber, the cold room, the white lights, and eyes watching from behind a one-way glass all witnessed the moment. His final meal wasn't extravagant, but it was complete: 2 double cheeseburgers, French fries, strawberry cheesecake with whipped cream, a vanilla milkshake, and a glass of grapefruit juice. When asked for final words, Van Hook turned toward the victim's family and said, "I'm very sorry for taking your brother's life." Then, in a calm, low voice, he began to recite an ancient Norse prayer. "Lo, I see my father. Lo, I see my mother, and my sisters, and my brothers." The prayer lasted nearly 2 minutes. Then, silence. The injection began to take effect. In an era where justice often feels cold and mechanical, this execution brought closure not only to a sentence but to a chapter filled with pain, repentance, and echoes of those who never had the chance to speak for themselves. 5th, James Filiaggi. Love, when twisted by control and anger, can become a weapon. The story of James Filiaggi is a painful reminder. A crime born from what was once a home. Lisa Huff. Filiaggi had once been James's wife. After a turbulent marriage, she decided to break free, reclaim her life, and protect her 2 young children. But James could not accept being rejected. On January 24, 1994, in the city of Lorain, Ohio, Lisa became the target of the very man she had once loved. After an argument, she ran to a neighbor's house to hide. She took cover in a closet, but James followed, broke in, and took her life. He was arrested shortly after. In court, no excuse could justify what he had done. James Filiaggi was sentenced to death for premeditated murder, a case of domestic violence that left deep scars in the community. For years, he filed appeals, only to later withdraw them. He said he wanted to accept his punishment and bring it to an end. On April 24, 2007, after 13 years on death row, James Filiaggi was led into the execution chamber at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. The method was lethal injection. Before the lights dimmed, he was served his last meal: steak, baked potato, pierogies filled with potato and cheese, dinner rolls, fresh vegetables, strawberry cheesecake, and a glass of milk, right before the drugs entered his veins. James looked toward his family. His eyes were tense but focused. He said, "I love everyone. The death penalty does not stop crime. It is simply legalized revenge. And sometimes, it takes the lives of innocent people." After those final words, he lay still, without resistance. The needle began its work, and everything ended within minutes. A sentence carried out, yet the debate over the effectiveness, ethics, and limits of capital punishment still echoes quietly behind the one-way glass. For Lisa's family, it was a long and painful road to justice, but that justice could never bring her back. James Filiaggi left behind a final warning. Love cannot survive when it's shackled by control, and when it explodes, the price is sometimes paid in blood. 6th, Frank Spisak. In 1982, at Cleveland State University, Frank Spisak carried out a series of attacks targeting people he believed were weakening America. 3 victims died, including a minister and an African-American student. He called it a purge to begin a purer America. At trial, Spisak didn't hide his neo-Nazi ideology. He wore a Hitler-style mustache, quoted Mein Kampf, and declared he wanted to start a new race war. Prosecutors called him a preacher of hate. His defense argued mental illness, but that did not save him from a death sentence. Spisak appealed for more than 25 years. His case even reached the United States Supreme Court. But in the end, every door closed. On February 17, 2011, at the Lucasville prison in Ohio, he entered the execution chamber without once looking back. The method was lethal injection, a familiar protocol in the state system. Before entering the chamber, Spisak was served his final meal: spaghetti with tomato sauce, fresh salad, chocolate cake, and a cup of hot coffee. He ate slowly, made no special requests, and showed no sign of emotion. Facing the witnesses behind the one-way glass, he didn't offer an apology. He didn't pray in the traditional sense. Instead, in a dry and steady voice, Spisak began reciting a Bible passage in German believed to come from an ancient Norse farewell ritual for fallen warriors. Seht da ist mein Vater, seht da ist meine Mutter, meine Schwestern und meine Brüder. Seht, da ist mein Volk zurück bis zum Anfang. Behold, there is my father, there is my mother, my sisters, and my brothers. Behold, there is my people, going back to the beginning, a strange farewell, of faith lost to the very end. Spisak closed his eyes. The chemicals entered his bloodstream, and then it was over without a tear. No forgiveness, no remorse, only a cold void left behind by a man whose hateful beliefs once brought terror to a university campus. 7th, Brett Hartman. On September 9th, 1997, in Akron, Ohio, a seemingly ordinary morning began with a grim report. Police received a call about a homicide at a quiet downtown apartment. When they arrived, even the most seasoned investigators were left speechless by the scene. The victim was Wynda Snipes, 46 years old. The brutality was shocking not only for the outcome, but for its signs of frenzy and the extent of the trauma inflicted. The suspect was quickly identified as Brett Hartman, 23 at the time, a computer technician who had previously been romantically involved with the victim. Hartman admitted he had visited Snipes' apartment the night before, but denied killing her. He claimed that when he returned the next morning, he found her dead and panicked, calling 911. But the forensic evidence told a different story. Fingerprints, DNA, and personal belongings all pointed directly to him. In 1998, Brett Hartman was sentenced to death. He appealed for nearly 15 years, with support from human rights groups who argued that the violence of the crime had overshadowed the uncertainties in the evidence. But every appeal failed. On November 13, 2012, at the Lucasville prison in Ohio, Brett Hartman entered the execution chamber. No more lawyers, no more delays, no more appeals. His final meal included a hot steak with sautéed mushrooms, golden fried shrimp, a baked potato with butter and sour cream, macaroni and cheese, a glass of Pepsi, a can of Dr. Pepper, and a bowl of honeycomb cereal with milk. Dessert was vanilla ice cream topped with walnuts. Once everyone was in position, Brett was asked if he had any final words. He gave a small nod, smiled faintly, and said, "I'm good, let's roll." A simple sentence, but one that carried either surrender or a final display of defiance. The poison began to flow in silence until the very end. Brett Hartman never admitted guilt. For the victim's family, it was the day justice was served. But for some observers, His case remains a reminder in the search for absolute truth. The sentence may close, but the questions may not. 8. Rocky Barton. On January 16, 2003, a bleak winter morning in Waynesville, Ohio, the sun quietly lit up the backyard of a house where Kimberly Jo Barton was quietly packing her belongings. She had just made the decision to leave her marriage with Rocky Barton, a man she could no longer live with. She never knew this would be her final moment. Rocky was waiting. He had locked the gate, prepared a gun, and as she stepped outside, he pulled the trigger in front of his stepdaughter and another family member, a brutal killing in broad daylight, at the very home that once symbolized their life together. After the murder, Barton tried to end his own life by shooting himself in the face. He survived, but with permanent disfigurement, forced to wear a medical mask for the rest of his life. Once recovered, he made no excuses and did not resist justice. In court, he pleaded guilty and refused to appeal. He asked to be executed as soon as possible, saying it was the only way he could make amends for what he had done. And so, on the morning of July 12, 2006, more than 3 years after the murder, Rocky Barton was taken to the execution chamber at the Lucasville prison in Ohio. Under the bright lights and the eyes of loved ones and legal officials, he received his final punishment, a lethal injection, quietly entering his veins, closing the chapter of a man who chose death as a wordless confession. In his final hours, Barton was served the meal he had personally requested: pork ribs with barbecue sauce, French fries, biscuits, over-easy eggs, and a can of Pepsi. He finished everything except the cherry pie, which he said he wanted to save for breakfast, a detail both calm and painfully ironic. Before the drugs were administered, Barton looked toward his wife's daughter and his own 2 daughters, all present in the witness room. He said, "I'm sorry for what I've done. I'm sorry for killing your mother. I don't ask for your forgiveness. There's not a day that goes by that I don't try to forgive myself. But don't let your hatred for me ruin your lives." He then turned to his parents and offered one final apology. And finally, quoting Gary Gilmore, the first man executed after the reinstatement of the death penalty in the United States, he said, "Let's do it." At 10:27 in the morning, the lethal injection was administered, ending the life of a murderer and one of the rare inmates in Ohio who voluntarily hastened his own journey to death. 9th, Adremi Dennis. On the night of June 4th, 1994, in the city of Akron, Ohio, a group of armed teenagers roamed the streets, looking for someone to rob. In the heat of summer, a split-second decision ended one life and sent an 18-year-old straight down a path with no return. Adremi Dennis, not yet 20, and his friend Leroy Anderson planned a robbery to make fast money. No ideology, no personal vendetta, just a string of reckless acts fueled by violence. Around 11 p.m., they ambushed 29-year-old Kurt Kyle, who was walking home with his girlfriend. When Kurt said he had no cash, Dennis pulled the trigger. One shot, swift, brutal, irreversible. Kurt collapsed in front of his girlfriend. Dennis and Anderson fled the scene, as if it were just another part of a teenage thrill. But the law saw it differently. Dennis was arrested shortly after. Throughout the trial, he never denied what he had done, but offered no defense that could soften the blow. He was sentenced to death. What made the case stand out was Dennis's age. He was so young, and over the years on death row, he changed. The teenage face from his mugshot slowly aged into that of a quiet man who knew his time was running out. On the morning of October 13th, 2004, at the Lucasville prison in Ohio, Dennis was brought into the execution chamber, a place where no tears could undo past mistakes. The method, lethal injection. His final meal included fried catfish, garlic bread, and 3 slices of pie pumpkin, pecan, and sweet potato. He ate so much that he asked for Pepto-Bismol to ease his stomach. Before the poison was injected, he turned to the victim's family and said, "I'm sorry for what I did. I did wrong, and I accept this death." His final words did not bring back Kurt Kyle, but in that last moment, Adremy Dennis did not run from his guilt. A sentence closed, a youth faded, and one life forever gone. 10. Scott Andrew Mink. September 19th, 2000. A quiet morning in Dayton, Ohio, calm outside, but chaos inside a small suburban home. There, a 36-year-old man committed a crime so devastating, even he could never forgive himself. His name was Scott Andrew Mink. Mink lived with his elderly parents, William and Sheila Mink. They had tried everything, even hiding the car keys, hoping to keep their addicted son from going out to buy drugs and alcohol. But that small act became the final trigger. In a rage, Scott attacked and killed both of his parents. It was an act of total collapse, driven by years of addiction and mental breakdown. The crime scene was horrific, so much so that investigators said it was one of the most disturbing cases they had ever encountered. Afterward, he took their credit cards, sold household items, and used the money to buy drugs. He didn't run for long. Soon after, he walked into a police station and confessed in court. He didn't blame anyone or make excuses. He asked to be sentenced to death, and after the sentence was given, he waived all appeals. Scott Mink was one of the rare inmates in Ohio who voluntarily chose to die. On July 20th, 2004, at the Lucasville facility. When time had run out, Mink was led into the death chamber, the method lethal injection. His last meal, eaten the night before, was a full spread of T-bone steak, baked potato with sour cream and butter, steamed cauliflower and broccoli, a cheeseburger with onions, lettuce, tomato, and mustard, extra salty fries, and a can of Pepsi. He finished everything except the broccoli. On the morning of the execution, he smoked a cigarette, drank some coffee, but ate nothing more. When asked for final words, Scott Mink simply said, "I just want to thank you for letting me make a final statement. I've made peace with my family and with God." And then, at 10:26 a.m., the overhead light poured down into the white room. No resistance, no tears, just silence and the weight of what can never be undone. 10 names, 10 lives pushed to the furthest edge of justice. They no longer exist, but what they left behind still echoes pain, fear, and a question that has never had a clear answer. Is the death penalty a form of justice, or simply society's final act of surrender? We may not all agree on the sentence, but we all feel the impact of what they left behind. If you believe this series has value, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the death penalty is still the right answer? In this century, I'm the storyteller, and this is where we tell endings, so we never repeat beginnings.